So I'm very excited about this next panel on religion and financial markets. And I'm delighted that Dr. Henry Kaufman is able to stay through the morning. He does have to leave midday for another occasion. But I suspect he's been looking forward to this one as well. We are co-sponsored by the Center for Financial Policy. Our next speaker just reminds me about the amazing range of expertise and backgrounds of our presenters at this conference. Richard Painter is S. Walter Richey Professor of Corporate Law at the University of Minnesota. He is in addition to an esteemed expert in his field, he's had an important impact on policymaking, particularly the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, a provision of which was influenced by arguments and proposals he made in a series of law review articles and to the SEC and the American Bar Association. He's testified in front of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. So I'm really delighted to welcome Richard Painter as our first speaker.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here, and I'm going to start with the problem I raised at the end of my article, and it's a problem that's been discussed by Dr. Kaufman and others, particularly after the financial crisis of 2008, but an issue that was talked about in the investment banking community before that. And that is the question of whether limited liability as a form of organization is appropriate in the investment banking industry and whether it works. My thinking about this issue goes way back to stories I heard from my grandfather about a business he had in the 1930s that he lost in 1943. And it was a business selling bonds. It was a two-man shop. And they did reasonably well in the Depression, enough money, enough to put food on the table, pay the mortgage, but during the Depression that was pretty good. But then he went to work for the United States government in the Treasury Department during the war to help Secretary Morgenthau locate and seize Nazi assets wherever they could. He had a partner back in New York who was in charge of the business, and it failed. He had to go back to New York, get a salary job, and pay off the creditors, each and every penny for those creditors. It was a corporation. He didn't actually legally have to, but that was the way of doing business then, and the most prestigious investment banks were actually general partnerships, where the partners were legally liable for all of the debts of the firm. So the small shop, even if it was a corporation, if you expected to do business on Wall Street, you paid your debts. And you paid the debts of your firm. And that's what he had to do. It was tough. And I remember hearing from him about what it was like sending my mother and two sisters to college and paying off the creditors and working for somebody else after having lost his business. And it did not matter that the reason you lost your business was you went to work for the government to help your country. It did not matter if it was your partner's fault. It did not matter whether it was your fault. It wasn't about fault. It was about responsibility. If you had a broker-dealer business and you had creditors and it failed, you paid. Perhaps you could have called the Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Morgenthau, and said, well, look, I came down to work for you. I lost my business. I need a bailout. Like the secretary would have hung up the phone in those days. Just about all the firms operated under that principle. Eventually, he joined a partnership, the Salomon Brothers and Hutzler Partnership in the 1960s, and they had the same rule. Each and every partner, from the top man on down, jointly and severally liable for the debts of the partnership. And the same thing over at the Lehman Brothers firm, under Bob Lehman, I believe it was. The top people were liable, but each and every partner personally liable. Morgan Stanley, all of the top firms. Something changed. 1970, Up until 1970, the New York Stock Exchange had a rule that specifically said you could not be a member firm unless the firm was owned by the investment bankers who ran the firm. You could not have a public float of securities under the New York Stock Exchange rule up through 1970. Investment banks had to be owned by the investment bankers. Now, we in the legal profession still have that rule. Every state has a rule that law firms have to be owned by the lawyers. You can't have outside shareholders. That's a rule in every state, except for the District of Columbia will allow outsiders to be partners of law firms to accommodate lobbyists. That is the only jurisdiction that allows it. So the legal profession still operates under the principle that the professionals should own their own firms. The investment banks operated under that principle through 1970. And then the Donaldson, Lufkin, and Jen Rent firm wanted to go public, and Bill Donaldson, future SEC chairman, simply told the New York Stock Exchange it was going to happen. And the New York Stock Exchange caved in. They changed the rule. They perhaps had to, because our firms needed to raise capital to compete with the larger European and Japanese and other investment banks around the world that could raise capital from public markets. So perhaps they needed to change the rule. They did, and one by one, all of the firms went public. Salomon Brothers, 1981, with a merger into Philip Brothers Commodities. The last major firm that went public, 1999, Goldman Sachs, although they were doing most of their business through limited liability entities throughout much of the 1990s, putting much of the risk into limited liability entities. Not all of it, but much. Does limited liability work for investment banking? In 2008, 3 of the 5 largest investment banks failed. All corporations, of course. Has it worked? It's been an experiment for several decades that we've tried. Has it worked? Now, we're never going to go back to partnerships, at least the way they used to be. And there were a lot of problems with the way partnerships used to be organized. But the personal responsibility that came with a partnership arrangement is something perhaps worth preserving. And I've written some articles, and I have a forthcoming book with a colleague of mine, Claire Hill, at the University of Minnesota, where we explore the options and suggest that perhaps bank boards of directors and creditors and perhaps even regulators ask the top investment bankers who run a shop, the few that are remaining, the Morgan Stanleys, Goldman Sachs, the rest, and there will be more that will come to replace those that have folded. But that we ask these top managers of investment banks to sign a personal guarantee or provide some evidence of their willingness to stand by their firms and pay a portion of the firm's debt if the firm fails in return for the extremely high salaries that are paid, which are far, far in excess of anything that the partners of the firms used to make in the old days. Should there be an understanding that if you share in the riches of investment banking in the good times, that you are willing to stand by your firm and the creditors, regardless of fault, in the bad times? So I've approached that question from an economic perspective, from a policy perspective, and the question I throw out for this audience that I do not answer in my paper is, how about from a faith-based perspective? What does our faith say? What does our faith tradition say about taking risks with shareholders' money, with creditors' money, taking a large portion of the benefit of those risks when they pan out, and then walking away from the situation when it doesn't pan out? Going to Las Vegas with someone else's money. Or as Louis Brandeis put it in 1915 in his book, Other People's Money and How the Bankers Use It. Now, I don't mean to be cynical, as I say, about bankers. I mean, wonderful people. Say my grandfather's a banker, made many wonderful friends in his bank, including Dr. Kaufman. It's a wonderful business, good people. has enormous potential to do good for society, but perhaps we need responsibility to come with it. And this is one particular aspect of responsibility that I inquire about. The responsibility, is there responsibility to pay the debts of your firm if the firm fails for whatever reason, and what should it be? Now, why can't we talk about religion and investment banking? Why do we have so much difficulty bringing these two spheres of inquiry together? I mean, there are enormously intelligent people in investment banking, people of great integrity and intellect, and then also in religion. But are we talking to each other? And if not, why not? And I outline in my paper significant hurdles for both the investment banking community and the faith community when it comes to talking to each other about whether it's the issue of personal responsibility for firm debts or any other question related to finance. Let's start with the investment banking community. We cannot ignore the fact that the history of the investment banking community in the United States and in many parts of the world has involved religious discrimination and segregation. We had a discussion earlier this morning about usury and the different views of usury in different faith traditions, and it is no secret that in Europe, Jewish people did not have the opportunity to pursue many professions, could not own land, did not have many opportunities, except for in some places they had the opportunity to engage in banking, and that various prejudices grew up in Europe out of that situation. And in the United States, we inherited much of the same. For many years, Wall Street being dominated by predominantly Protestant investment banks, Morgan Stanley at the top of the heap, that overtly discriminated against Jews and to some extent discriminated against Catholics in admission to partnership and even in basic employment. I outline in the paper the empirical evidence that was gathered in the 1960s by the Anti-Defamation League and other groups about discrimination against Jews, in particular in commercial banking, which is a different area of banking, with the large commercial banks that would be lending. They were federally insured since 1933. There was a very intense discrimination against Jews in the commercial banking area, with some shocking statistics looking at the top commercial banks in the late 1960s and the almost complete absence of Jews from the hierarchy or even mid-level employment in those banks. Investment banking, somewhat better but segregated. The so-called Jewish investment banks and the others. And then some firms, I think Salomon Brothers is a good example, that really tried to focus on hiring on the merits. But the discrimination was most all of it, not entirely, but most of it, from the predominantly Protestant firms against Jews. And as I say, to some extent, against Catholics. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a recognition that this was morally wrong from a faith-based perspective. It was bad for business. This is not the way you run an effective business. You're going to alienate clients and others, and that something had to change. And the easiest way to deal with that is to simply say, we're not going to ask about religion, we're not going to talk about religion in the investment bank. And if we reintroduce the topic of religion into investment banking, we run the risk of going back where we were before, and nobody wants to go there. So that is a hurdle that needs to be overcome. Now, you would think we've made so much progress, at least with respect to religious discrimination on Wall Street, that we could move beyond that. And perhaps we have, but the problem is we are in a global economy. Investment banks are opening up offices all over the world. So while the problem of anti-Semitism and segregation in the New York investment banks may be history, and history receding into the past to an extent, the problem of anti-Semitism, of anti-Islamic feeling, prejudice against Muslims, prejudice in some parts of the world against Christians, prejudice against Hindus, against others, is serious. And indeed, after the Cold War, we've seen religion come once again into the role it has often had in history as being an excuse for conflict among peoples. And so investment banks that are operating all over the world and want to have an office in Tel Aviv and may want to have an office in Riyadh and may want to have an office in New Delhi. It's going to be a big challenge if we start saying, well, let's talk about religion. That is the one thing that has caused a lot of, I don't think religion has caused the problem. I should say that as human beings, using religion as an excuse for conflict, for acting in a way that really violates the basic tenets of all religious faiths. But human beings using religion in this way has created conflict and anger, and if you want to do business in a global economy, talking about religion may not be the way to go, and we are going to have to confront that concern. Indeed, talking about religion, your faith, overtly in some parts of the world can be, it could even be dangerous. Back in New York, we have New York branches of investment banks from all over the world. So while we may feel we've eradicated religious prejudice, we made great strides in the past few decades, whatever prejudices there are from elsewhere in the world are going to come back. I can't hire a Muslim in my investment bank. My clients would be scared, that type of thing. And we're going to have to confront that. So there will continue to be pressure to stand firm by the proposition that faith should not have anything to do with banking. Once we go down that road, it's too dangerous. I'm not endorsing that position, but that is one of the hurdles that we have to overcome. A third problem is the problem of affinity fraud. Now, this is something I have looked at in the 1990s. I was actually brought in as an expert witness by Arthur Anderson to look at what happened in the Arizona Baptist Foundation matter, which was basically Arthur Anderson didn't do as good a job on the audit as they could have. They wanted to blame the lawyers. It's an interesting situation. My opinion's being quite public on that. But the Arizona Baptist Foundation sold presumably what were church bonds. And by the way, the Securities Act of 1933 exempts charitable institutions from the requirement to register their securities for sale to the public because charitable institutions are not motivated by money. Well, I don't know the actual rationale, but they just put the exemption in there anyway. Along with municipal bonds, by the way, because politicians are honest and business people are not. So anyway, the Arizona Baptist Foundation is selling church bonds to retirees in Arizona who are convinced that these bonds will be used to build new churches, that they will have a safe and secure retirement, and because they've done the right thing with their money, that they will have a safe and secure life in the hereafter. The proceeds are used for various very risky Arizona real estate ventures, and the entire foundation collapses. The Arthur Anderson audit isn't worth what it says it is. Similar problems over at Enron that same year with Arthur Anderson's audit. A debacle. Just one of many instances of affinity fraud. Apparently the state of Utah, which is heavily Mormon, has more affinity fraud per capita than any state in the United States. The Jewish community, we know, was victimized by Bernie Madoff, who took advantage of his faith-based connections and his affiliation with many prominent philanthropic organizations. Among his victims, being many from the older generation who had experienced some of the worst crimes against humanity ever and could not imagine the idea of someone in their faith community stealing from them. People understood that there's something in the world far more important than money. It simply doesn't matter how much money you have when society falls apart. And couldn't imagine how a faithful man could steal from them. And he took advantage of that. And there have been psychological studies that I've quoted in my paper talking about how different groups respond to affinity fraud in different ways based on past experiences and so forth. The affinity fraud problem is going to be a huge one if we wish to talk about religion and investment banking or anything in finance, because people's antenna is going to go up and think, gee, this person is talking prayer because they want to cheat me. And indeed, faith is based upon the notion of trust. Trust in God. I trust God even though I do not see him. I trust God without verifying. And not only do I trust God, but the next step is I trust my fellow parishioners. And in Sunday school, they still, in some places, have that game where the kid falls back and the other kids catch them before they hit the floor. Trust in God, trust in fellow parishioners, members of the congregation, trust without verifying. Not necessarily a good idea in investment banking or any other area of finance. Trust without verifying. So the basic philosophical tenets of most faith traditions, when used in the investment context, can lead you down that road to affinity fraud, and people are concerned about it. It happens over and over again, just with more and more dollars involved, seemingly, each time, and there's going to be enormous pushback there. And then there is the fact that in this day and age, we see a decline in participation in organized religion. We certainly see this in the mainline Protestant community. There have been studies looking at the Jewish community. So at least in the United States and in Western Europe, there has been a noticeable decline in participation in organized religion. Not necessarily. That does not necessarily support the proposition that people do not have faith and do not think about God and the importance of their faith for their lives. But participation in organized religion, where we can keep statistics, generally is on a decline. And the Catholic community as well in the United States has been affected by that. So are those who are talking about finance and faith going to be talking to a smaller and smaller audience? And do we see the rise of substitutes for faith, particularly in the financial community? I mean, one substitute is, of course, money and the worship of money, but also the worship of work and the notion that work in and of itself is a virtue, without necessarily a lot of attention paid to what are you working on and what are you accomplishing with your work. So we have the old notion of the Protestant work ethic. Is it now just simply the work ethic, just get the religion out of there, but also not as much focus as perhaps we should have on what is the work for, what is the objective, why is it important? And then there's charitable contributions. That if you want to do good works in the world and you are a successful banker, there are many outlets for that, many contributions you can make to faith-based organizations and to secular organizations that pursue good works. And that is the way to act out your faith or your philosophical commitment to humanity, not in the office, but outside the office. Once again, reinforcing the segregation philosophically between what happens in the office and outside. Now, this issue of buying one's way out of purgatory has been addressed time and time again. The Reformation, of course, the Catholic Church was accused by Martin Luther of selling indulgences to well-to-do sinners. And there, among the 35 Theses of Martin Luther, 1517, one of them, well, many of them dealing with the sale of indulgences, my favorite, saying there is no divine authority for preaching that the soul flieth out of purgatory the moment the money clinketh at the bottom of the chest. Well, are we today? As a society, not just the faith-based establishment, but the secular establishment endorsing the sale of indulgences, giving indulgences and not looking too carefully at what people are doing in their work, so long as they give generously. And of course, we can bring our campaign contribution arena into that entire equation as well. It's not just charity. So there are many obstacles here to a discussion of faith in banking, in the banks, among the investment bankers. Now let's talk about the faith-based community and how the faith-based community could reach out to bankers, because ultimately I see that there is going to be more opportunity for dialogue if the faith-based community begins the discussion and reaches out to bankers in the congregations to learn from those bankers what really happens in banks, so that the ministers and rabbis are not operating on the basis of very broad assumptions of what banking is all about, but genuine understanding. What are the challenges for the faith-based community? And those are many as well. I mean, first is the notion that money is somehow inherently evil. Money is the root of all evil, a distortion of the actual biblical passage which says that the love of money is the love of money that is evil, not the money, the love of money. When people love money instead of God and loving their fellow human being. But that the church needs to focus not on simplistic views of money, but really understanding. So that's one of the problems that we confront. The other is the fact that for some churches, and I noticed this in my own church, in the Episcopal Church, if you talk about money, and particularly something like investment banking or an elite profession such as that, you are going to reinforce stereotypes about your church. And stereotypes that we want to get away from. That the church is a church of the prominent business leaders. I mean, it used to be something that many churches would say, well, that's a mark of pride for their church, that the prominent business leaders would go to their church rather than others. You can notice that rivalry component there, and many, many problems with that attitude in the past. But we've gone to perhaps the opposite extreme of we don't want to talk about money too much other than in certain specific ways. First, the annual appeal. You're not going to duck that one, or you're not going to be in business very long. And second, the general obligation to give to the poor. And then maybe some general comments about how business needs to be more ethical, without suggestions exactly as to how one can live the Christian life or the faithful life as a Jew and be a good businessman, but simply condemnation. Now, this is not true for all of the clergy, but this is a problem. That if we simply operate in terms of condemning what people are doing, say this is wrong, well, let's talk about what is right. I think this notion that discussion will reinforce stereotypes it's sensitive for certainly some mainline Protestant denominations, and I think it's sensitive for some rabbis. If we're going to have a discussion about what was wrong in 2008, is there somebody out there who's going to use that maliciously? Because you don't need to look very far on websites to find anti-Semitic websites that will blame the crisis of 2008 on the Jewish community, motivated usually by concerns about disputes in the Middle East or whatever it is. And so by starting this dialogue, are people going to use it and misuse it to take us down that road? And we're going to need to be cognizant of that problem. So there are many challenges for the faith-based community in dealing with religion and banking and investment banking. And I don't mean to sound pessimistic. I think we can overcome these challenges with leaders in the faith-based community in particular who reach out to, as I say, parishioners in the investment banking field and others who work with people of other faiths jointly, and I think that's one way to overcome the problem of prejudice, that we can have discussions among several faiths and interfaith dialogue, such as our meeting here today. But that is, I think, a very important thing for us to do as a way forward, because I think religion and faith are relevant, very relevant, to investment banking. I've illustrated one particular problem in my article that I'm very concerned about: personal responsibility for firm debts. But there are others as well, and we need to face those issues as a society, and not just from the perspective of economics and history and sociology, but from the perspective of our faith. So I thank you for inviting me here to have this discussion. Oh, yes, questions?
We have some time for questions and comments, and just loving the way that money, and so we're going to hear that in a few minutes. So please.
Paul Muda from Grand Valley State University. I have a question about the tension related to the diversity of religions within, say, investment banks or any other business. It seems that as we deal with a more diverse population of people, we have mixed religions, we're minimizing the opportunity for the discrimination that you talked about. But then along with that, there's a dilution of values, of the ability to directly recognize and talk about religion because we don't want to have tensions, so we avoid the topic altogether. But along with that, the strength of the moral perspective seems to decline hand in hand, so there's a trade-off that's going on there. Is there a balance between saying there's value in having tighter in-group, faith-based organizations or populations where there is common vocabulary, stronger common values? You know, one of the things that strikes me is really a great thing within the conference is there is a lot of commonality in values across all the religions that have been presented. But it's almost like there's a lowest common denominator when we're all together. And if we're talking separately within individual populations, the values can be promoted and heightened in a way that has a bigger impact on ethical behavior and morals. Not sure I'm communicating that clearly, but
yes, I understand. This is I mean, what I've suggested is the faith-based community should take the leadership role here in reaching out to the bankers. We're not going to have a Bible study at Morgan Stanley. Maybe there is one, I don't know. I think that the faith-based community needs to reach out to investment bankers, and different faiths need to work together in doing that. The problem with working it the other way around, and going back to faith-based banking, which, by the way, let's look at the few remaining faith-based banks. The Vatican Bank, we can go through the list. There have been problems there as well. So the notion that a bank, particularly if the bank is populated by people of a dominant faith, who feel they have a lot of power in society, that somehow that bank can behave ethically because there is a cohesion around a certain religious group. We all go to the Episcopal Church on a certain day and so forth. History has not borne that out. I mean, look at the financial crisis of 1929. And the interesting thing is that mostly the Protestant establishment banks that got themselves in the biggest hot water, although all the rhetoric was, some of them you were using behind closed doors was blaming out other groups. I don't think the banking industry is going to want to go back there. There are going to be parts of the world where there will be faith-based banking, where almost all or predominantly all the bankers are of one faith. I don't see that in a country as diverse as the United States. I don't think it worked very well in the United States. And indeed, I mean, I go back to the experience. My grandfather's a Protestant, joined a firm that a lot of Jewish partners, wonderful friends he made there, wonderful people. He got to know people of a different faith. And I think that is enormously valuable, particularly in a country such as the United States. So I don't think I want to go back where we were before. That notion of the old partnerships didn't work very well. The personal liability, that's different.
Stephen Brown.
I don't want to interrupt in this conversation, but since you personalized the,
Yeah.
I will tell a story.
The mic seems a little soft.
Mike, yeah, that's.
It's okay. Do you hear me?
That's
In any event, what Mr. Painter is talking about, among other things, is a gentleman by the name of Sidney Homer, who was my first boss at Solomon. And after a number of years, I got a call from Sidney saying, Henry, I want you to know Bill Solomon is going to offer you a partnership in the firm. And of course, I was very pleased. And he said, but I want you to tell your wife that next week when you sign the partnership papers, you're going to be personally liable for $3 billion. And my wife said, when I told her that, she said, why did you want to do that?
And it was a very different firm. I mean, that Liar's Poker book, written by Michael Lewis, is an interesting book. It does not describe the Solomon brothers, certainly that existed before the 1981 merger when they went public, and I will remain agnostic as to the 1980s. I think the Wall Street culture changed because all of the firms changed.
Stephen Brown in the accounting department here. It seems to be that when we hear about the things you're saying, then, yeah, there's a bunch of good stuff that bringing religious values could do. But all the good aspects of it seem to me not to do with religion. They're just to do with good morals and good behavior. And they're quite apply equally well to atheists. And I don't see that this is a religious thing at all. It's just, I mean, if you go back to the golden rule, or let's be, why can't we all get along, be nice to each other, do behave honestly, and so on. And so religion seems to be bringing potentially a lot of bad stuff with all the discrimination, and obviously it doesn't happen all the time, but there's clearly that danger. But a lot of the other stuff is, the good stuff doesn't seem to be, to me, particularly religious. It's just...
Yeah, for many people it is, but I certainly would wish to include here, and I should emphasize in the paper that the secular humanist community should be included in this conversation as well. I have not been convinced by the notion of atheism pushing, well, God doesn't exist. I mean, at some point, let's talk about what you do believe in. And people who believe in human values, don't derive that system of beliefs from a divine authority, have a lot that's valuable to say. I'm not so convinced that recently, well, God doesn't exist and the billboards and all. No, let's talk about the human values. That's the valuable contribution. It's not the denigration of someone else's religion. Well, Muhammad doesn't exist, Jesus does. Or God doesn't exist at all. I don't think those conversations are useful or contribute. But the conversations that are useful are, what are my values? And values are derived not from a divine authority, but from a humanistic understanding of morality are extremely important to include in this conversation.
My name is Rachel Anderson, and I work with the Center for Responsible Lending. And I actually have the unique role of being the director of faith outreach there. So I work with religious communities around the country who are concerned about predatory lending. And so my perspective on this is much more, I guess, from like lived theology from the communities that I have seen and worked with. And I'm really interested in the proposal that you made about the faith community reaching out to the banking world. And in particular, I'm curious if you or others have looked at, and this is kind of from the Christian tradition, the role of the kind of the faith at work movement, and thinking specifically of New York. There's Redeemer Presbyterian Church, which has grown massively over the past 10 years, has about 5,000 members now, and is really kind of, my sense is investing a lot in this conversation about vocation and meaning, and I think it'd be really interesting to find out if there's any real empirical impact from that kind of practice.
I think it will help. We need to have more of it, but it needs to be a conversation that gets into some of the specifics and constructive solutions. And a lot of these conversations are very general, and at some point we need to have leaders in the faith community understand finance and know what's going on in finance, and can sit down with bankers and have intelligent conversations on topics such as, I understand limited liability is used in many, many industries, but there may be some industries where the risk is too great. The externalities imposed on society and on others are too great. Should we at least question the use of limited liability in that context from a moral perspective as well as an economic perspective? But we need to get the faith leaders down into the specifics rather than too much of the generalities. We have the generalities, people feel good, They walk out of temple or out of church and forget about it. That's not where we want to go.
Please join me in thanking